Hello. So I've been reading Eastern philosophy books. I recently got a bunch of Alan Watts books, and I'm going to go into the history of Buddhism a lot more thoroughly. I think right now, most of the books I'm reading talk about Chinese Buddhism. And then I'm going to go into Japanese or Tibetan Buddhism and look at the history of Buddhism. But it occurred to me that in the background of my mind as I was going through the day, that there's types of reading where you're getting like a way of life or an outlook on life, and you're going to read different books that give you different outlooks on life that are mutually exclusive from one another. And sometimes it's going to cause a conflict. For me, it is causing a conflict because I'm someone who's always been very much goal-oriented and like developing goals and pursuing them. But the kind of Taoist outlook on life, you could say, or the Buddhist outlook on life is to basically almost do something because you're doing it for the enjoyment. There's no end goal in mind. It's like you're almost eternally present. You're not looking for the future outcome, or you're not looking too much into the past. You're just focusing on what is momentarily in front of you. And that is something that's hard to make mend well with the goal-oriented view of life. So in general, then, why the reason I'm making this video is because I think this is an interesting subject for book readers to get into. And I have some books here that I'm going to recommend. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means. It's just books that were laying around my house. And as I walked around for 10 or 15 minutes, I found these books. These books are just books about ways of life, or what I think are ways of life that you can read about. So the first one is A Guide to the Good Life by William B. Irvine. And I have this book around here because Stoicism is not a monolith of thought. People hear about Stoicism, generally speaking, they think like there's just this one idea, like being emotionally resilient is like Stoicism. But that's not actually what Stoicism is. Stoicism is like a catch-all phrase in the same way that like Eastern philosophy is a catch-all phrase or Western philosophy is. And this book goes over different Stoic ideas. One of them being that like the focus on, I think they call it like negative, I think it's Epictetus calls it like negative visualization. I think that's the expression used. And the idea here is like when you, for example, I think Epictetus actually says, if you hug your child, remember that it's not something that's permanent. It's a very temporary thing. And that child is immortal and that child will die. You have like negative visualizations towards the things that you like so that when the bad comes, the thing that you care about, you can be resilient towards that. You won't be too impacted by the positive or negative emotions with the good or bad consequences of fortune for the child, right? That's one of the ideas in this book. And there are a few other ideas, but I'm also going to mention Cicero, so I won't go over the entirety of this book. On Becoming a Person by Carl Rogers, I think this book is not necessarily about a way of life, but kind of what he talks about in this book almost amounts to a way of life. So this book is very much the Jungian idea, I think, although maybe some others have talked about this as well, is that the examined life, like in terms of therapy, like doing self-reflection on how you were raised as a child, your emotions on a day-to-day basis, even to some extent your dreams, or considering your natural propensity for things like your intrinsic personality features. Looking at these things as the only way to become like a person or a fully developed character. And if you don't do that, then you're kind of missing out on parts of life, so to speak. And so I think he is prescribing a kind of a self-reflective life is the best way to exist. And I think that's why this book is on here. So this next one is Flow. This basically isn't necessarily a way of life book, but I think if you follow the advice of this book, it becomes a way of life. And it's very much in line with the general outlook of, I guess you could say Eastern philosophy as a whole, like the idea of behaving ritually, for example. Basically, the idea in this book is that the happiness or the best way that you can live your life is to be constantly in the flow state or the state of focus. You got to be doing something with your attention or with your mind. And when you're doing something with your mind or with your attention, you don't have any space for negative emotions or even excessively positive emotions. You're just lost in like a stream of consciousness, right? And that's what this book is kind of about. And I think that is a way of life in itself. And if you do that enough throughout the day, yeah, it constitutes a way of life. The marshmallow test. So this is not necessarily a book for a way of life, again, but it kind of, if you follow the advice inside this book, it becomes a way of life. So the premise of this book is that self-control is a limited thing, and that self-control is the biggest predictor for success in life, which is kind of not necessarily an innovative thing, but like an interesting thing to debate inside psychology, because there's a lot of research that suggests certain variables are better predictors for outcomes in life. But he's arguing that self-control is. And so what happens is if you implement the advice from this book, is you're going to try and structure your life in such a way that you'll have self-control throughout every domain that you actually care about, right? And so as a result, the underlining way of organizing your value structure or your value hierarchy becomes about almost not quite self-denial, but the imposition of control towards a certain goal, right? That's what your life becomes if you implement the ideas from this book, which is a very different idea from Stoicism or from Taoism. This book, Radical Honesty by Brad Blanton, kind of goes on the idea that you should always tell the truth, and that it's infinitely better to tell the truth all the time, but he does also recognize that there are some pragmatic limits to being honest, but he encourages honesty for the most part in the kindest way possible. Now, in the kindest way possible can be debated. Some people say that the kindest way possible is not to be honest at all. And some people think that you can be completely honest while maintaining kindness. This is something that's debated ad nauseum. But I believe what he's leaning towards is the kindest way possible being that you should still be honest, but it should still be kind. And it doesn't just apply to others, by the way, it applies to yourself. So for example, when I play chess, sometimes I get really frustrated because if I had like 6 hours of sleep and I only got 6 hours of sleep because I did something stupid the night before, like maybe I was on my phone or on the screen or something, maybe too mentally active before bed. And then the next day I play chess and I perform terribly and I get angry. I need to be self-honest about that being a shortcoming, right, of my character, and that I need to improve upon that. Because some people will just not have that self-honesty. They'll have the anger and not use that anger as a moment of like self-criticism or self-awareness and just move on. And so the anger just kind of blips in and out without any reflection about it. This book would argue that you should be like radically honest about everything in life, not only with yourself, but also with how you interact with others. This next one is great. I don't want to say too much about this because it is very much similar to Stoicism, but the idea behind this book is that resilience and to some extent liking the things that you're doing, but mostly resilience is what's going to be the fundamental driver for success in your life, and so that you should have resilience in everything in life. So for example, if you're someone who wants to reach 10,000 hours, let's say in chess or math, or let's say lifting weights, whatever it is, right? There's going to be a point where you're going to get bored and you don't want to do it. And so the ability to mitigate the temptation to quit is with his resilience, and that is going to be the biggest predictor of your life. It's not too different from Stoicism. I think Stoics would probably agree with this, but this book has a little bit more of a technical meaning behind the word grit, and so that's why it's its own recommendation. Ralph Waldo Emerson's Nature and Other Essays. I think you could just the only reason I mentioned this book is because I'm actually talking about his notion of self-reliance. And I believe that is in this book. I could be wrong. But if it's not, then it's another book somewhere. I don't know if it's in this book or not. Basically, Emerson has this idea that it's you should have self-reliance, that a strong character should be composed of someone who can rely on themselves. Because ultimately, your destiny in this world will be determined by your own ability to achieve things. It's if you're waiting for others to give you the solution to things, or waiting for others to give you a hand, you're doomed to fail, and you're going to be doomed to having a weak character. And Emerson would argue that you should have not to like a toxic level of self-reliance where you don't ask for help with anybody else, or you don't network or work with other people. But if you don't have any level of self-reliance, right, then that's going to be a problem, because a lot of the things that are worthwhile achieving in life are going to require some level of self-reliance. And so you could argue that like relying on others versus yourself is a spectrum, and as a result, it can be somewhat of an influence on the way your life is shaped. And I think Emerson would fall more towards the reliance on the self for the most part, rather than on the others. Maybe you could say like an 80-20 rule. And so that's why that book is on there. The Conquest of Happiness by Bertrand Russell. So this book kind of is an argument for a way of life, but it also talks about how to, not just a way of life, but also how to avoid being unhappy. And so one of the things he would suggest is finding something that you like doing, which kind of goes to like the flow state idea. I think he doesn't say it's flow, but he just says pursuing something that you like doing is a great way to become happy, because he was really depressed and suicidal when he didn't have something to do. And then he said he stumbled upon math, and that really got him into a different outlook on life, and he started to enjoy it. But he also argues in this book, for example, that we should avoid things like hyper-entertainment. So like, let's say you do work 6 hours a day or 7 hours, whatever, 5, 4, whatever, how many hours a day you work. Russell would probably argue that the time you spend not working shouldn't be on something that is hyper-entertaining. So television, radio, in the modern times, probably video games or your cell phone, like doom scrolling. You should avoid all of these habits, and you should try and keep your mind on like, almost like a neutral level. You could say he's like a perpetual neutralist if you're trying to compare him to, like, say, like the Western world of being like full send all the time, aggression, 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 versus, let's say, like the Eastern world of like Zen and quiet and calm. He's like in between the two of them, I would argue. Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, is basically a book that argues that not only as an examined life, the good life, but a life pursuing virtue is the good life. And by virtues, he means things like honesty, generosity, education. I don't know if kindness would be considered one, but basically, yeah, a good life can only happen if it's a life lived of virtue, because in order to be happy, you need virtue. And so if you're pursuing happiness, what you're really meaning for Aristotle is pursuing virtue, which is a different outlook. It's more of a specified worldview. Like you're looking for virtues in particular so that you can get to the solution of happiness. Other books try and argue slightly different, that you should be pursuing ways of life, but it seems like he's arguing you should be pursuing skills, so to speak. Right? Like generosity is something that you can train yourself at being better at. And education, like becoming better at math or becoming better at languages, is something you can train yourself at. It doesn't seem to be saying that just lose yourself in action. He's saying if you acquire skills, you'll become happy. And that's kind of how I interpret this book. So this book, Cicero on the Good Life, is basically his reflections on a lot of things, like friendship and work, like work life, or I think he worked for the state, so I think it was state life. But there's something in here where he talks about duties, and I think for him, duties is a very important thing. He thinks that through your fulfillment of duty, you will find happiness. Not that you will find happiness just through doing something random. He thinks there are like almost objective things that humans should be obliged to do. And if you neglect those objective things, you won't have a good life, right? So his is a much more like objectivist philosophy of life. And if you don't fulfill those objective goals, you're going to be unhappy. That's like the best TLDR I can give of this book. So these two books here, Alan Watts' The Way of Zen and Tao, The Watercourse Way, are just Eastern philosophy books. I think Alan Watts is mostly Chinese Buddhism. I could be wrong. Maybe he's a lot more broad. I'll let you know when I finish reading him. But yeah, this is just two books that are going to argue for like this kind of, you shouldn't categorize your mind in a bunch of different ways. You should just realize that there is no such thing as a self. and the self is like an illusion, and a lot of the other categories of the human mind are very illusory. And what you should do is just focus on the eternal present and just do things that are enjoyable, not things that you want to do, but that things that you just find enjoyable. And I believe he has this, like when people ask him, well, then what about like the nature of desire? Doesn't desire not work inside your worldview? People usually say this to him, but he usually responds by saying that like the way he chooses to behave on a day-to-day basis is not through desire, but it just seems to be spontaneously what he enjoys doing, and so he does it. That seems more like a word game, to be honest, but yeah, these are two books you can read if you're looking for like a general introduction to like a Taoist or like a Buddhist way of life. And then the last one is The Asceticism of Isaac of Nineveh. I don't know how to say this, but this book is in here because ascetics have a very interesting view of life that is composed of like extreme self-denial. And it's very different than a lot of other worldviews. So for them, it's not necessarily the pursuit of happiness. It's almost like the pursuit of extreme self-denial to basically be in line with, let's say, virtue, and virtue in their sense is like goodness in the eyes of God, or like it's something that by doing it, you become more spiritual. Like their self-denial practices are a way of engaging in spiritual practices. In fact, some ascetics, what they'll do is they'll pray for like 20 or 30 hours. And that's another form of, not necessarily maybe self-denial, but like the opposite of pursuing pleasure. You should be actively pursuing pain is almost what they're arguing. And that's a very interesting way of life. I find sometimes it works for me, sometimes it doesn't. I do like the idea of self-denial. Like for example, I don't know, if don't touch any technology for a day, this could be a way of self-denial. Don't touch food for 24 hours. This could be like an interesting self-denial challenge. Or, I don't know, meditate for 10 hours. These are all interesting practices that are really hard to do and will give you a sense of reward if you do them. So you can make with that what you will, but this is just another way of life, or another book related to a way of life. So those are some of the books that I have on my shelves. I have more, but like those are probably the more explicit ways of life books. I think, for example, St. Augustine's City of God is another book I had considered, where it's basically arguing the avoidance of sin is a good way of life. And I think Russell talks about the consciousness of sin being a bad way of life. So there's another kind of debate that goes on. I'd be interested to know what books you guys have read that encourage specific ways of life. I know, like, for example, Atomic Habits is another book where he thinks you should just structure your way of life such that everything is a habit. That is kind of interesting as well. I'm interested to see what books you guys have. And with that being said, bye-bye.